So in Screencast 3 I want to talk to you about some economic theory which will help us understand a bit more about the background to the rationale for government intervention in markets, and specifically in the sports market. So I want to talk to you about the market system and how consumers and sellers, suppliers interact. And I want to talk to you about a very common and well-known idea, which is the invisible hand of the market concept. And the reason we talk about this is that subscribers to the concept of the invisible hand of the market are those who subscribe to low levels of government intervention, who say that governments generally, as a rule, should not get involved in markets or should minimise their involvements in markets. And against that discussion and that argument, I want to also make you aware of the concept of market failure, and how some theorists believe that the invisible hand of the market doesn't meet all needs, which means that markets do fail, and if markets fail, then governments need to intervene to make sure that benefits and everyone's needs are met. And I want to talk to you about how this works in the sport industry. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is the invisible hand of the market and the market system. So here's a very typical kind of graph diagram that you would see in any economics book, and this has two axes and it shows price and quantity, and as we move up or along the price axis, price is increasing. As we move along the quantity axis away from origin, quantity is increasing. So if I draw a line, or what is quite often called a demand schedule, this shows consumer demand. And it's quite natural that consumers want to maximise their utility. They want to maximise what they can buy at a minimum price. So the natural relationship for consumers between price and quantity demanded is a negative one, which is as price increases, quantity declines, and conversely, as price decreases, quantity increases. So we can see this slope which shows this. So if prices are high, say at this level where I've got my mouse now, and we hit the demand schedule and plot it to the quantity axis, we can see that the quantity demanded is lower than if the price is low, say down here, and we move across and plot down, the quantity is significantly higher. Okay, so consumers naturally want to maximise the quantity that they can buy at a lowest price. Okay, so suppliers, on the other hand, have an incentive to sell goods at higher prices to increase their profits. So the higher a price that the market will bear, and that suppliers believe a market will bear, the more they are likely to supply. So here we have the supply schedule, or the supply curve, which shows us that if price is relatively low, then demand provided or quantity provided is also relatively low. But if the price is higher, that provides more incentive for suppliers to produce more. Yeah. Okay, so what usually happens in this scenario is that in economics, the invisible hand of the market says that consumers' demand and suppliers' willingness to kind of produce goods and consumers' willingness to pay means that demand and supply will reach a point of equilibrium where consumers can buy what they want for a price that they're willing to pay, and suppliers can produce goods and be happy that they can sell all their goods. Now, to illustrate this, let's just look at what happens if we move out of price equilibrium. Suppose that the price that is charged in the market increases, right? Now, currently at price equilibrium point, we can see that this is the quantity demanded in the market. But if the price increases, what happens? Well, if we plot this down, we can see that quantity decreases. Okay, so if quantity decreases, this means that there is an oversupply. There is excess stock in the market. If there is excess stock in the market, what can we expect to happen? Well, as suppliers seek to shift their excess stock, they will cut prices, right? So prices will be brought back down to the equilibrium level. So they will start to reduce their prices until an equilibrium point is reached. So an increase in price leads to oversupply in the market because quantity demanded decreases. If quantity demanded decreases, suppliers have excess capacity, excess stock. If they want to sell the excess capacity and excess stock, they need to reduce prices, and what we see is that this pressure forces the price back down to the equilibrium point. Okay, so suppose prices drop. What happens if prices drop? Well, if prices drop, we can see that supply, so this is supply here, quantity down here, is below what it was at the equilibrium point. So if supply does not meet demand, then consumers cannot have the goods that they want at the price they previously had. So what do? The natural reaction is that consumers begin to bid up prices. Okay, and as consumers bid up prices, gradually we will see prices move back to the equilibrium point. So this is the point of the invisible hand of the market. It means that the playoff between suppliers and consumers, so suppliers represented by the S schedule, and consumers demand represented by the D schedule, competitive forces in the market will always ensure that a price equilibrium point is always arrived back at, no matter what changes happen in the marketplace. Now, let us show you just one more example of this. So let's take a sport example. Let's say that, after the Olympic Games in 2012, demand for a sport product increased. Okay, so this is what economists refer to as a change in consumers' preference. Tastes and preferences change. So this can be because of the effect of successful Olympic Games, increasing demand and interest in sport. It can be success of a social marketing campaign like This Girl Can, or Change for Life in the UK, which seeks to promote more healthy, active lifestyles, which can raise demand in the market. So here we see that the demand curve has shifted to the right, which means that demand has increased. Okay, so demand has increased. So at whatever price, so if this was the price that was previously paid, this would be demand. But now we can see that demand has increased, and at this price there is a significant increase in the quantity demanded. So if we go back to our price equilibrium point, we are saying that at this price, this is the quantity which would be demanded. So it's well in excess of the quantity that is currently supplied in the market. So again, we have a situation of oversupply. And we can see that oversupply in the short term will lead consumers to begin to bid up and increase the price that they will pay. Now, over the long term, if businesses and firms can see that demand is increased, well, demand is outstripping supply and price is increasing, this will attract more suppliers into the marketplace and supply will increase again until we reach PE1, which is price equilibrium 2. So as demand changes, so supply will also change over the long term to actually meet that demand. So the invisible hand of the market theory says that there's no need for governments to regulate prices or to interfere in the market to improve supply, because the market mechanism will always ensure that over the long term demand will meet supply and that the needs of consumers will be met, and so will the needs of suppliers be met. And the market is the most efficient way to ensure that this happens. So this concept is based on the work of Adam Smith, who was an Enlightenment thinker, who wrote a very influential book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. We don't need to know lots of detail on this, but what we do need to understand is the invisible hand via the price mechanism ensures this perfect balance between the needs of firms and customers, this concept of optimal resource allocation, which really means everybody gets what they need. Customers and business, everybody is happy. Yeah, everybody gets what they need, right? And this argument is used usually by parties to the right of politics, conservative politics, to say that there is no need or limited need for governments to intervene in markets. And this is called free market economics or neoliberal or laissez-faire policies. Laissez-faire literally meaning leave it to be, leave it alone. So this is influential kind of on the right and even the centre right of politics. But on the centre left and the left of politics, there are people who disagree with this. And some of the problems that people who disagree with this are that some of the assumptions in the invisible hand of the market are wrong. And one of these is that the assumption in the invisible hand of the market is that consumers are rational. They make rational choices. They will always maximise their utility. They will do what is good for them. Now, in sport, as we've seen, sport is a non-durable consumption good. Sport is a durable consumption good as well as a non-durable consumption good. So a durable consumption goods, the benefits are sometimes deferred. Yeah, so you do sport to improve your health, but it takes some time to build up that level of activity and you've got to maintain it. And we know that people dip in and out of sport, or know they should do, but don't do sport. We don't always do what is good for us. So humans are not rational. We do not always make rational choices. And the other thing that the invisible hand of the market assumes is that everything has an exchange value that can be monetized. And we'll see that some resources which are required for physical activity, it might actually be fairly difficult to monetize those in such a way that it's possible to make a profit. And this leads others to argue that markets do fail to meet needs because consumers are not always rational and don't always do what's good for them. And also, sports goods, it's not always possible to charge a market value, a high enough price, which will be attractive to suppliers so that they will meet demand, or meet demand such as might be desirable in order to achieve the externalities which governments and individuals may desire. So, this is an important political debate. We're currently in a situation where we've got unprecedented government intervention in markets, closing down sectors of the economy, paying people's wages, and there's a big debate at the minute about should the government be intervening like this, or should it just leave it and the businesses which are going to be successful will survive this and weather it, and those which aren't probably weren't going to be successful and viable in the long term anyway. And we can also see that, you know, the leisure industry, so sports centres and facilities which have been particularly suffering, are also looking for government intervention, yeah, because of this shock that's happening, yeah. And the sports sector is asking government for a £2 billion support package to help bail it out. So this isn't just kind of a random abstract economic concept. This is a real issue and a real debate which is live at the minute. So let's think about market failure in sport. And Grattan and Taylor identify two causes of market failures in leisure and sport. And one of these is externalities and public goods, which we'll talk a little bit more about soon, and equity considerations. So to understand this, let's just think about these two terms, public goods and private goods. So when private goods are consumed, the individual receives most of the benefit. And these are based on two important characteristics, rivalry and excludability. Okay, so if I want to buy a cake in a shop window, if I buy that cake, you can't buy it as well. And if I eat it, you can't eat it as well. So if I buy it, you can't buy it. That's rivalry. If I eat it, you can't eat it as well. That's excludability. Okay, so if we ask you to think about where this could apply in sport and leisure, this can apply to a physical good, like a pair of running shoes. If I buy those shoes, you can't buy them. And if I'm wearing those shoes, you can't wear them at the same time. So that's rivalry and excludability. A ticket for a sports event, if I buy that ticket, you can't buy the same ticket, right? And if everybody else, if the tickets are sold out and the capacity is reached, so if a certain number of consumers buy tickets, capacity is reached, that means that you can't also buy it. And if you can't sit in the stadium, you can't watch the game. So there are some examples of private goods in the sports market. Public goods, on the other hand, means that the benefit of consumption is not limited to one individual. So consumption is non-rival and non-excludable. So usually if we were in a lecture, I'd ask you to answer this or give me some examples. But since you're not, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So outdoor recreation and sport is a good example of this. Running, yeah? Where do you run? You run in parks, you run on roads, yeah? Parks, where do you play football? A lot of people play football in parks. It is quite often informally it's quite difficult if you're playing football informally in a park to charge for entrance. It doesn't happen. If you are orienteering in the Peak District National Park, then it's difficult to charge an entry price, yeah? The capacity is such that, you know, we can't really say this is the capacity of the Peak District National Park. We don't really close off parks and say you can't come in because it's full. And if I'm running in the Peak District National Park or playing football in a park, usually it's not the case that it is so crowded that other people are excluded. So for certain goods, and for example, outdoor activity in the sports market, it's very difficult to exclude people, yeah? So rivalry and excludability don't work. Okay, so if goods are public goods and exhibit the characteristics of being non-rival and non-excludable, then it is difficult to ticket this, to charge a price, to make a profit, right? And this is called the problem of the free rider in economics. You cannot ensure that everyone will pay the price or that people will pay the price, so you cannot generate revenue. So there is no incentive for suppliers to supply or increase their supply because they can't charge a price, they can't charge a higher price, so they're not going to supply. They're not even going to enter the market. Okay, and this is an example of market failure. So we can see that where we can classify goods as public goods, then the market is not going to meet the needs. And, you know, participation in football in parks and running in parks, cycling on roads, outdoor activity in the Peak Districts, walking recreationally, these are significant elements of participation sport where it is difficult for these to be provided through the commercial sector, through suppliers. Yeah, the market won't provide it. So government needs to provide, the argument therefore is needs to provide parks and needs to provide national parks, yeah, to ensure that these activities can happen, right? So the argument is that governments need to intervene because these needs are not met efficiently and they're not met equitably. So governments can intervene in the markets to try to ensure that positive externalities are maximised and negative externalities are controlled, right? And we can see that if we think back to the social return on investment in sport, there is a strong incentive there for governments to ensure that positive externalities associated with sport are maximised, right? So, and we can also see that, you know, the government might want to control negative externalities. So we talked about taxation on smoking as a disincentive. So, you know, thinking about this and going back, so this is from the UK government, the last time they wrote anything on this. This is a Labour government back in 2002, and from their strategy at the time, which was called Game Plan, a strategy for realising the government's sport and physical activity objectives, they said that the government does not run sport, and nor should it, but government intervention is legitimate where it remedies a gap in voluntary or private provision and the benefits of intervention, i.e. the externalities, outweigh the costs. And we can see that social return on investment shows us for every £1 invested in community sport, the benefits that flow back are £3.28. Okay, so there is a clear economic argument there for government intervention in the sports market. Okay, so there is two broad reasons therefore why there might be a gap in private or voluntary provision, this kind of gap filling concept. So the first is inefficiency. So private and voluntary provision may be inadequate in some way, right? So private provision might not be able to provide because it's not possible to charge a price, to meet their costs, to generate a profit. And voluntary provision, the demand may be too big and too significant for it actually to be met. And this undersupply results in reductions in consumption and therefore social welfare that might be avoided by government intervention, by governments intervening in the market. Okay, so inefficiency, market inefficiency is one argument for government intervention. Okay, so swimming is an example of this. So I know that many health and fitness clubs have swimming pools, but the reality is that they do not offer generally school swimming programs, a full events competition. They do not offer the full range of aquatic disciplines because it's difficult to charge the market rate for those things that's required to actually generate a profit. Similarly, the investment in swimming pool stock is simply too big for most voluntary sector organisations to be able to afford, and therefore the government, through local government, intervenes to supply swimming pools in the public sector, which are largely subsidised, yeah, because it's difficult for a market price to be charged which will allow a profit to be generated or costs to be met. The other argument is inequity, and inequity really means fair access, and a lot of this is to do with ability to pay, right? And the government might wish to intervene to promote fairer access to all than would otherwise be achieved if it was left to the market, right? And this is an interest in social justice as well as economic efficiency. So this is about making sure that people on lower incomes who may not be able to afford to participate can benefit from cheap and accessible sports services in order to be able to participate, in order to be able to have the personal benefits and also the wider social externalities. And also there's another concept which is merit goods, and merit goods are those which are good for us, but quite often we don't demand enough of what is good for us. So not everyone will invest in their education in the way that you're investing in education. So if I was to give you in your hand now the money you've borrowed to actually take this course, some of you may actually be tempted to go out and spend it on something else for immediate gratification rather than a long-term investment. So not everyone would make the rational decision, which if you put the evidence in front of people, which is on balance, if you invest in yourself, you will generate greater income for yourself further down the line. Not everyone would make that decision. Okay. And if we do not consume enough of what is good for us, if we don't stay in education, we won't have the right skills in the economy, which will mean the economy can't grow and thrive. If we don't consume or engage in enough sport and physical activity, society as a whole would not see those kind of social benefits that we saw evidenced through Shroy. Okay, so it's important that we do that. So therefore, the government has a role to promote these goods. Merit goods and demand side interventions. So the government has a role in demand side interventions, and these are interventions which are developed to try to increase demand. And we've got the Change for Life campaign and This Girl Can, and these are campaigns to try to raise awareness and to increase demand for healthier, more active lifestyles. And governments can also intervene on the supply side. So through local government, they can provide cheap facilities and activities, subsidised facility provision. And they can also seek to increase the number of facilities, invest in coaching and invest in clubs to increase opportunities to participate, right? And conversely, the government also has a role in regulating the consumption of those goods which are bad for us. Demerit goods, these are called. So if we look at this diagram, which is taken from a book from 1995, Understanding Leisure by Les Haywood, this shows us that if we think about sport as being an activity as being either active or passive, so active involvement in sport could involve doing sport, participating in sport as a participant or as a volunteer, and passive consumption of sport could involve watching sport and gambling in sport. So we know that increasingly people watch sport online and gamble on mobile devices. Okay, so and this is about production of sport, active production of sport, and passive consumption of sport. So what is government's action on this? Well, governments tend to subsidise and encourage active production, but licence and control passive consumption. So passive consumption of leisure might include drinking alcohol in a venue. You're not involved in creating something, you are purely consuming, and we know that alcohol is licensed and controlled. Betting on sport as you watch a football match, well, betting is licensed and controlled. Whereas active sport, there is a rationale, an economic rationale for subsidy and encouragement because of the externalities. which are associated with this. I just want to talk to you briefly about another concept, another rationale for government involvement in sport, and this is the concept of infant industry. So quite often, as an industry is developing and growing, and we see this in technology, so digital. Sheffield is trying to become a digital city, and most modern cities are trying to develop digital industries because they're seen as a growth industry of the future. Now, obviously, certain areas, so Silicon Valley has a competitive advantage in that area, and other areas of the country, Cambridge has a competitive advantage in that area in the UK, and Sheffield may want to develop this to improve its economy, to provide better jobs, and to improve the strength of the local economy. And so it offers subsidies to tech firms, to actually, in digital companies, to actually work here. They have subsidised office space and support from government and local government. So government quite often subsidise production of a good in the early stages of development if it faces severe national or international competition. Now, if we think about the 1996 Olympics for Great Britain, that was one of Great Britain's worst performing Olympic Games. And what happened after that is that the government investigated through the lottery. The national lottery was launched around this time. The government investigated other countries, what other countries are doing. They looked at the Australian Institute of Sport model and borrowed that, and so began to invest in elite sport because Britain was seen to be struggling in the face of strong international competition. And previously the UK government didn't really invest in elite sport, but through the launch of the national lottery and with the impetus of the poor performance at the Olympic Games in 1996, it began to do that. And so the government then funded EIS sports facilities to try to support Olympic sports to perform well, but it does not support professional football clubs' academies because there is a market there which allows them to generate players and sell players on part of their player trading policy to actually generate funds and revenue, make a profit on players, to actually spend on developing their squads and growing their squads. So there isn't the same tradable value in athletes in Olympic sports that there is in professional team sports. So infant industry is another argument for government intervention at the elite level of sport. So we've talked about externalities and merit goods as being a rationale for government intervention in sport at the participation end of the market. At the elite end of the market, infant industry arguments are a case for government intervention in sport. Okay, so that's the end of Screencast 3, and I just briefly want to talk to you in Screencast 4 about government failure, and where government fails, there then becomes an economic rationale for the voluntary sector and government support for the voluntary sector.